Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar, Understanding the Risks and Costs of Security Breaches to Your Company, sponsored by Logarithm and broadcast by UBM. I'm Tim Wilson, Editor-in-Chief of Dark Reading, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides via the Resources widget. Toward the end of our webinar, we will ask you to complete our survey found at the right hand of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen, or type the issue into the Q&A area, and we'll be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. And now on to our presentation, Understanding the Risks and Costs of Security Breaches to Your Company. We're excited to have this conversation today. Risk is one of the key issues that is raised by Dark Reading readers to us on the publication every day. We're constantly being asked how to measure risk, how to measure the cost of a breach, how to understand, what your investment should be in security versus what the costs are, and how to couch that in a way that your upper management can understand. And to do that, to talk about it today, we have a couple of great speakers. Our first speaker today will be John Perranti, who's president of IP Architects. And we also have with us Michael Daglish, our director of sales engineering at Logarithm. I'll give you just a little bit more information about each one of them. John is the president of IP Architects. He has designed and implemented enterprise-wide electronic business solutions, information security and risk management strategy and programs, enterprise resiliency capabilities, and threat and vulnerability management solutions for key customers in a range of industries, including financial services, energy, government, hospitality, and many more. We also have with us Michael Daglish, our Director of Sales Engineering at Logarithm, who has built a team of security professionals who are growing strategic relationships with the partner community. Michael is an industry veteran, spending the last 15 years deeply entrenched in the network and security world. When not on the road evangelizing security intelligence and SIM, he spends a majority of his time researching the latest attack vectors, kill chains, and advanced evasion techniques. So welcome to both of you. Just so our audience knows, what we'll do is we'll have John talk for about 30 minutes. Then I'll hand it over to Michael for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Just so you know, you don't have to wait to ask a question. Please feel free. Anytime you hear something that you want to know more about, please send us a question, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session. So with that, John, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation. In the preparation for this, Tim, myself, and Mike were talking a lot about just that conversation that we're asked all the time. Talk to us about risk. How do we represent risk? How do we understand risk? How do we decide our risk appetites and tolerances? There's so many different vectors and angles that we can go with that so many different people throw at us that sometimes it's hard to understand what's really representative of what's important to us and to our businesses and what's important to our business leaders and our customers and the environments that we serve. So in my portion of the conversation today, I want to start out with what I call an anchor conversation. And the anchor element is an information risk profile. Because when we start talking about risk and we start talking about risk acceptance and risk management, risk understanding, what I find is you need to start out with some documented version of what is our risk appetite? What is my organization's risk profile? Are we risk adverse? Are we accepting of a lot of risk, and what areas and how and what ways? And that really helps us start dialing in some of those metrics and those understandings and those conversations to have stronger, better business-grade conversations with leaders and with customers and with partners and with vendors to make sure that we're all on the same page, to make sure that we're all working to the same conversation and working to the same goals to ensure that we're giving the success that's expected. So we're going to go through a couple areas in the time we have. First, we're going to talk about what an information risk profile is and go through what the do care for information and data assets is, material business impact considerations, some endorsement and updates, and some final thoughts. So the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, what is an information risk profile? You know, we throw this around sometimes in insurance areas and in leadership teams. When we talk about enterprise risk, we often talk about what is that risk profile. In your own lives, you may experience this when you go through financial planning or things like that, where you're asked, what's your risk appetite? What's your risk profile? What is okay for you? We have so many different sources of industry information, so many sources of industry data that talks about the things like the cost of security breach or the risks that would be associated with a breach, different angles, different elements, different lenses, different points of view, which are all very good and very important and very interesting angles to think about. But what we need to understand is what's important to your organization. We need to look at this and say, how do we internalize all that great external data from all those studies, from all those researchers, from all those independent evangelists and people who really do this every day and see a lot of things? How do I correlate that, and how do I make that something that's meaningful to my organization? That's what an information risk profile is really designed to do. It documents the types, the amounts, and the priority information risk that an organization finds acceptable and unacceptable. And when I talk about information risk, I'm not talking about information technology risk or information security risk solely. We're talking about information. We're talking about a data-focused approach, because data lives with us in logical and electronic and physical formats. It can go through word of mouth. It goes in any different direction in any different way. So we're talking about the information of the organization in all measures, in all ways, in all areas that it exists in our world and exists in what we do. And we call this our information risk appetite. You know, what is the ability of what we find to be acceptable and unacceptable? What are those boundaries? What are those models? When you look at organizations that they do financial risk planning, operational risk planning, enterprise risk planning, all those wonderful things, they define that. In most cases, they'll tell you what is acceptable loss. What can they lose financially? What can they lose from a customer perspective? What can they lose in marketing data? Even availability sometimes factors into this, how long they can be down or without service. But often we haven't really gotten there for information and information risk. So this is kind of extending that conversation. Now, to do this well, we really do this collaboratively with the business leaders and stakeholders throughout the organization. We want to get a holistic view of expectations and requirements. So as risk and security professionals, we're very good about understanding the understanding of threats and vulnerabilities that exist in the world and exist that could affect organization in negative ways that we wouldn't want to. But our business leaders don't necessarily have that appreciation. They're being thrown a lot of different elements of information from media coverage, from industry requirements, from compliance expectations, from word of mouth. They have so many different angles that are being put at them. We need to put it away that we say, let's co-collaborate with you so we don't become yet another noise factor, but we work with you to really dial in and understand how to identify what are the things that we care about, to get that holistic view of expectations and requirements. Now, I'm often asked, and I'm proud and lucky enough to say I do work all over the world with organizations small and large. I'm always asked the same question. How do I get leadership to get involved? How do I get them to listen? How do I get them to act? How do I get them to move? And by developing a risk profile, it's one of the most effective tools I've ever had and ever seen work in organizations. Because if you do this well, and if you do this collaboratively, and you do this with others, you'll find that they really want to be involved and they want to know better. If we do this well, a risk profile is going to provide clear and concise understanding of how to align the risk and security activities with the expectations of business and its leadership. So we want to make sure we have that alignment always. And by using the word risk and presenting in the word risk, we're empowering our business leaders as well, because we're letting them make the choices. We'll say, we will build to what your risk appetite is. We will not go beyond. We will not do less. We will go within what makes sense to you. So it's not really a friction point or an understanding point of how we're going to go back and forth of whether we should or should not do something. Now, as we dive in, the first thing I want you to understand is this concept of due care for information infrastructure and data assets. Now, due care is a common legal term that's used in contracts and legal circles and litigation and things of that nature. And unfortunately, we live in a world of litigation right now, especially when it comes to information risk management, security, and data breaches and things like that. So if we're thinking about the costs and the risks associated with security breaches and what goes on with them, we need to understand what are those definitions, because a lot of times our leadership is being told these definitions by the legal counsel they're going to. If they have a security breach, if we do have a situation occur, something happens, they're going to go to legal counsel and talk to them. So here are some of the common legal definitions for due care. First, the effort made by an ordinary, prudent, or reasonable party to avoid harm to another by taking circumstances into account. And second, which I think is a little better for our conversations and things like that, is due care refers to the level of judgment, care, prudence, determination, and activity that a person would be reasonably expected to do under particular circumstances. That reasonable is the most important conversation point we have to have here. What can be reasonably expected for an organization of our size, structure, our business model, and the type of data we're handling? We're changing the perceptions in the world of information risk and security of what's actually due care regularly. If you look at litigation, if you look at what's happened in as far as fines and judgments and things like that, just on an annual basis, you'll find that it changes. It's becoming more stringent. It's becoming more requested that there's more effort being done. Whether it's a small business or the largest enterprise, we have certain baselines of expectation when we're dealing with customer data and customer privacy situations, personal health information, personal identifiable information, things that affect the population become really important to say, are we doing the things that we can be reasonably expected to do or should be doing if we're going to be in that business model? Now, when we look at the due care for information risk management and security, we often look at this associated with compliance efforts. The first place people go typically when they think about requirements and expectations and concerns and what would happen if we had a breach and what are we liable for and what we need to do is we run to compliance. There's no question that compliance has been the primary driver activity in the information risk management security world for the last 7 to 10 years. Things like the PCI standard, FISMA, FFIEC, state privacy laws, EU data privacy and security, they just keep getting more and more, and there's more on the way, by the way. There's more requirements coming at us every day. So often we find that people say, well, what am I told to do? What is a third party expecting me to do that will hold me accountable? And those things are great as a baseline, but they really don't cover with what you really should be doing over time. In fact, a lot of the standards that exist that we use for compliance requirements are either behind by 2 or 3 generations of current state of requirement, or they're some ways watered down to be able to be used by a broad population. And that's not to say they're not important or good things, but they set a good starting point, not a good ending point. So what I like to say is that it's better for us to look at this as alignment with industry-leading and commercially reasonable practices is a more appropriate way of looking at this. Now, I'm the first one to tell you that I don't believe there are many best practices as an external party that I can tell you about. There's some general best practices that we can do at a very abstract layer, saying it's good to think about security, it's good to have layers, it's good to have things in place like that. But really, I can tell you what are leading practices or commercially reasonable practices as an outsider. You as an individual decide your own internal best practices and what makes sense to you and your organization, because only you can decide what's best for your world. But if we can align with the current leading and commercially reasonable practices, that really sits with the due care situation. Because if you have a breach and you start thinking about breach response, and if you get to litigation and you get down to a situation where you're in a case, you're going to actually be questioned that way. Did you do what was considered industry leading and commercially reasonable at that moment in time when the event occurred or when the incident occurred? Now, the most important thing I want you to also think about with the idea of a risk profile is that we're assisting decision makers in making informed decisions. Now, as a risk and security professional, I've been doing this for over 25 years. Sometimes I see people make bad decisions. I think all of us see people make decisions that we wish our leadership wouldn't make. And they're making them for reasons that we may not always understand or agree with. But it's their choice to make those decisions. We, in most cases, are there as a support infrastructure to the business and business operations and to our business leaders. So one of the things I find that information risk profiles do really well is they assist decision makers in making informed decisions by reducing friction between the business and security personnel. So we want to transform the security individual from adversary to advisor in the eyes of that senior leader. And by giving them a risk profile, by giving them an empowered document that says we're collaboratively understanding what do you care about, where do you want to spend time, what's important to business, it really does become an advisor relationship versus saying, hey, you need to put in encryption, or you need to put in a bunch of new endpoint protections or new technologies or new capabilities, which may be the right answer, may be the endpoint we get to. But we need to go in such a way that helps them say, we've done this based on the risk profile that we built together. Here are the control frameworks that will meet the expectations. So we're going to document the organization's risk appetite and tolerances, so we have that current perspective and future vision of risk and risk acceptance, so that we're constantly working within those boundaries. We're also going to reduce the subjective information risk management assumptions often used by information risk and security professionals. Look, we all have those moments where we say, just listen to me. I know better. I'm in this industry. I know how to work this. I know the threat exists. I know the vulnerability exists. Just listen to me, Mr. Business Leader. You'd be better off if you did. But we really need to remove that smart person effect, because that business leader doesn't always believe what you're saying. That business leader has been burned before. We've been wrong sometimes, believe it or not. Sometimes we provide protective techniques that are way above and beyond what we should be, and then we get hit with a breach someplace that we thought was not as important. So we want to get rid of that smart person effect, and we want to document and show a logical explanation of how we got to our results and how we get to our thought processes. So here's where we actually get into the elements of a risk profile. One of the first things you want to put in place is the current state view of information risk. So what is the current state analysis of your information risk factors? What are the things through a threat and vulnerability analysis activity or through some risk assessment activity that you performed have a high probability occurrence and a material business impact? You know, I often say it's important to understand the possibilities and plan to the probabilities. So we want to talk about the things that are really right now the things we worry about as a high probability of occurrence. And once we know that they have a high probability of occurrence, what's their impact going to be? Is that material? So in recent times, we often have updated risk profiles, especially in the last 24 months, to include more things like ransomware, or more breaches of personal health information, or losses of network capability through denial of service, as we see more denial of service attacks coming back into line. A lot of these things are very cyclical, by the way. Those of us who've been doing this a long time, and I know there are many people on this presentation who have been doing this a long time, know that attack vectors and attack surface and vulnerabilities, they tend to be very cyclical. They tend to be mappable. They come back and they come back in force. So we need to understand which are the ones that are coming at us, and if they do occur, is it material? Is it truly going to hurt the business? Because that's what the business leader cares about. Is it something that's just going to be something that can be corrected easily and it's going to be a nuisance? That's different than being material. You have to identify the business leaders and stakeholders' view of current information risk, so we can give them, as risk and security professionals, some views on the things that we think they should think about. But what do they think about? What are they hearing about? What are the things they worry about? Do they care about a breach? Do they think a breach is something that they can work their way through? You know, we've been through enough breaches in the world today that we actually have some playbooks. We have some decent ways of approaching these things. There are, it's not as a disjointed model of response any longer. We as risk and security professionals have gotten really good at walking through different techniques for response and recovery and things of that nature. So do they think that's important, or do they look at information risk saying, well, no, we're not really ready. We're really concerned about this. It's core and key to our business. It's important for our go-to-market strategy to represent that we're doing this very well. Every business is going to have their own view, and they're always going to have that view that's internalized to themselves. And we need to collaborate to give them that view. We need to document that so we're all on the same page. We want to document the current business conditions and obligations as well. What are our level of concerns? What are our contractual requirements? You know, often I talk to business leaders who say, I don't want to do this, or I don't want to do that, or I feel like some sort of technique or control is overwhelming or is going to be painful to my business. But we often have to say, have you contractually obligated yourself to doing so? Or do you have a compliance requirement that obligates you to do so? You know, there are certain things that we are just forced to do, not because they necessarily make the most sense or the right things to do from a technological perspective, or maybe even from a risk and security perspective, from preventing a data breach or preventing a challenge or a adversary from being successful doing malicious activities, because we said we will do them, because in the eyes of our customers, in the eyes of our partners, the eyes of our constituents and our stakeholders, they believe it's important for us to do so because they may have a different view. So we need to document all those things out so we all know what we're dealing with and where we're going. Then we need to understand our future state. Where do we want to be? And when do we want to be there? You know, we all know that risk and security is amazingly interesting and fun and fascinating because it changes constantly. It's not stagnant. It's why I consider this the top of the pyramid of the IT world, the information world, because we're constantly having to navigate new and interesting challenges because adversaries are constantly trying to get around everything we do, as by design. So by doing so, we need to say, well, where do we want to be and when? So identify the ideal or expected future state of information risk management. What do we want to be? What is our level of appetite we want to achieve? What level of protection? What level of loss do we want to accept? What level of protection do we want to be able to use in our marketing, in our advertising, our services and capabilities to say we're doing really well or not doing well? What are our expected states of capability? What are the information risk initiatives that are planned or actively underway to get to that level? As business conditions change, as we all know, budgets change, priorities change, concepts change. These expected future states might change as well. So we need to also document where we are with the current activities that are planned or actively underway to reach those initial goals of expected future state, but also have them in a way that we can adjust and be malleable, knowing that they're probably going to change over time. Typically, I look at these things as 3-year cycles. I don't think it's really viable to plan beyond about 3 years to really say that we have truly achievable goals. 5 years is probably a stretch scenario to say that we might hit a maturity level or we might hit some sort of target state at a 5-year point, but that should be realigned constantly. Now, I like to use capability maturity models and radar charts to visualize these data points. Radar charts are absolutely essential when you're talking to leadership teams. Absolutely essential when you're talking to individuals who are trying to understand through visual representation what is going on, where they are, and where they want to be. And these are often called spider charts or radar charts. And easily in these areas, what you want to do is identify current state and future state, and where do you want to be and how you're getting there. Using a capability maturity model really allows you to dive in a little deeper and say, based on information risk management security principles, we have a rating system that can be easily understood and aligned to, and we can say how mature do we want to be and where do we want to be, and we can track that accordingly. We also need to know what our key business processes are. Identify those, document those key business processes and understand why they're important and what is important. Often I find when I walk into organizations, my team finds it's the same. We come in and we think we may understand what's going on or what might be important and key. And when we talk to leadership teams, those things can change quickly based on different business strategy, based on different business activities, different business views of the world. Things go forward. Things change. Things constantly adapt and mold and go in different directions. So we need to understand what are the key business processes for your organization and why they're important. Why at that time when you're building this profile has it been considered and is it rationalized to be important? Make sure that we have owners identified and documented for those key business processes as well. There has to be an owner if it's a key business process. It cannot be some ambiguous state. Now, I know a lot of people are probably shaking their heads saying, geez, John, you say that, but that's so hard to do, especially when it comes to information owners and business process owners. At some point, there has to be some person or individual or business process owner that is accountable for the processes and the data that's supported by those things. Otherwise, we can't have effective governance. We can't make effective decisions. We have to have someone take on that role. Now, you can have joint ownership of stakeholders. You can have people who have interests in those things and have material concerns about them, but there has to be an owner that's not disputed and that is understood. And then we also have to understand our internal and external dependencies. Today's organizations, how often we find ourselves sourcing to third parties, whether it be cloud implementations or third-party vendors for business process outsourcing or vendor operations or simple things as payroll and as benefits or things like that. Many organizations do have an information supply chain. So we have to understand what dependencies we have for our key business processes. For them to operate, is it just us protecting ourselves where we have direct control, or do we have to worry about governing concepts to third parties? What does that information supply chain look like? What are those dependencies? What could go wrong if something goes wrong outside of our control? What are our third-party relationships and use cases? What are we using them for? How are we using them? How will we govern them as well? As we think about that risk profile, one of the things that's coming up more and more and more in conversations in the last 5 years or so are the impact of third parties on business operations of first parties. So your organization and organizations I work with often may become highly dependent upon third parties to the extent that you may not be able to operate without them. In just recent times, we had situations like service interruption at Amazon that caused a lot of organizations to be really challenged in continuing business operations, and the primary organizations that were serviced by Amazon in this situation, they really couldn't do much at that point. They didn't really understand that that was a real risk. They assumed that Amazon had done all the right measures, and they had done good measures, things like this, but they wouldn't have interruptions or outages, and they had service level guarantees and things in place that prevent that, when in this case they found out they didn't. So now we're really revamping and building up those third-party relationships and uses to understand, geez, how does that affect our information risk profile? What are your key data elements? So we talked about key business processes. Now we've got to talk about key data elements. What are the things that we care about? What are the things that are important to our business operations to survive and thrive? So some of the things that we talk about often are intellectual property, customer and transaction data, financial data, non-public personal information, and private health information. We know now that private health information is highly targeted, highly coveted by the attack community, so we understand how that's being used, operated within an organization, where it's going in. And believe it or not, you don't have to be a health organization to have PHI. If you have benefits data, you have personal health information. It's got to be thought about. It's got to be understood. We need to have a data dictionary for these elements so we understand what each data element is and their value to the organization. And make sure the terms and definitions are consistent across all the different groups you're working with. This is why the risk profile becomes so important. It creates a common platform where everybody can work from. And again, all data elements have to have an owner. Back to that ownership. We have to have people who own these things. We have to have somebody who are responsible for risk management decisions and have dependents and stakeholders identified so we can understand who needs it, how they're using it, what they're using. Again, I know this can be challenging, and often people say it's impossible for my organization. We all share the same data, especially as we're looking at data lakes and data pools and business analytic models and things like that. But you got to look at this going forward and say, how do I have somebody that I can go to that's responsible, especially if I have the breach? If I have a problem, that's the individual that's going to be held responsible for the breach cost and the breach situation. So we need to make sure we go back and understand what that looks like and where that's coming from. So as we keep moving forward in the elements of the profile, we start building through. And now we start asking about business value. What is the business value of that process, of that capability, of that technology, of that information? Because we can't have the cost to protect information exceed its value. And this is where we often get into challenges in risk and security about how do we justify our worth? How do we justify our value? With the amount of investments that organizations have been making in the last couple of years, the amount of work we've been doing, it's all really good stuff and it's all really good things. A lot of people now asking at the leadership level, justify your worth, justify the value, justify all this investment. And it's often hard for a risk and security professional to do this without saying, well, we haven't been breached, we haven't been compromised, we haven't had major incidents, so that means it's working. Now, that's always been the way that, as we say this as risk and security professionals, we haven't had a problem because we're doing the right things. But that's hard when you're doing budget cycles. It's hard when you're making hard decisions at the leadership level to say, should I continue investing in this way? Should I continue making such large investments in these technologies, these capabilities, these processes, controls, these individuals and staffing, things of that nature? So we need to understand that business value conversation that says, okay, what is that business value? What is the cost? What is the cost if we lose it? Cost if we have a breach? Cost of the challenge? When is it material? Versus when it can be lost without significant business impact? A lot of data is seasonal or time sensitive. It changes in value. Whereas when it's new and fresh and interesting, it might be very valuable to the organization, and as time progresses, it may become less valuable to the organization. Materiality might change. So we assess data value by identifying the processes and associations. So quantify the value of the business processes and then the data. That's an easy way to do this. Start saying, well, is this a key revenue-generating process for us? Do we make money out of this process? Do we have value there? Ensure that visibility exists in the third-party uses in our supply chain. If we're selling that data or that business process is extending to third parties and it's critical to their activities, we have to take that into account as well. It may not be critical to your activity all the time, but it may be critical to third parties at the same time. Now, I want you to know that risk profiles do not need to quantify exact values. We're trying to get general representation of value and evaluate the obvious data elements first and then assess the unclear ones. Start with the easy things. Start with the things that make money. Go to talk to your CFO. Talk to the finance team and say, okay, what happens if we lost this? What happens if we lost this kind of money, or if we lost this kind of data, and what would be the amount of value or cost to us? What happens if this business process would fail? How much would that hurt? What would it cost us on a day, a week, an hour? Different finance people have different models that they represent to on a regular basis. So then we'll get into data classification. We've got the data. We've got the business processes. A data classification scheme is really important to organize data into easy, understanding containers. Now, the schema should be simple and useful. It's got to be something that people can understand and can work with very simply and represent what that means to them. I often say you want 3 to 5 levels, and there's no right answer. It really comes down to your culture, your environment, your expectations of the groups you're working with. Personally, I like 5-tier models because I think it gives us a little room, but I like to have something in the middle. There's got to be a starting point that's that middle state that says, okay, let's start out at a 3, or let's start out at a middle point if we're doing a 3 and a 5-tier model, a 2 and a 3-tier model, that says we don't know if it's really important yet, we don't know if it's not really important yet, so let's start at a midpoint and then either degrade or increase the ranking and the schema. And each of those levels should have more control. So as we get higher, they'll have progressively stronger and more comprehensive control objectives and requirements. By doing so, in the risk profile, we're kind of giving ourselves room to say not all data is created equal, and we can move the bar around. The categories, we want to have categories that give us the frameworks to organize and communicate the information in an easily recognizable format. We want to make this stuff visual. We've got to make this easy. So you want to provide a scale to represent the level of material business impact that would result in information risk were to be realized. Make sure that we can represent the data in a heat map if possible, because it's easy to recognize, it's visual, it's understood, and people are used to seeing heat maps. They understand heat maps. Here's some risk levels. You probably have all seen these things, but they need to be documented. As risk and security professionals, sometimes we take it for granted what these things mean. But when I look into organizations, I say, well, do you know what the high, medium, or low risk is in an organization? Have we got a definition? Do we have an understanding? This is a kind of a state they say, well, we kind of feel like we understand it, but we don't really know it. And when it comes down to a situation occurring, a breach situation, or an incident occurring, we want to know that in more detailed understanding, or even as we're developing our thought processes. So examples of risk levels I often use are the high, medium, lows, and you can look at the definitions underneath here and take these away as things that work very well. Use them often, find them to be very effective. Another area for categories of risk and security professionals that are easy for us to use is the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability. As we're building out the framework, we're building out the model, the visualizations, and the risk profile. This aligns us back to our information risk and security backgrounds and our information risk and security perspective, because these are 3 areas that we all commonly agree are very important when talking about that topic and that understanding. So now we talk about how we bring it all together. And as we bring it back together, we have our example of information risk level visualization. So I took some key business processes from a generic organization. Everybody's just going to be different, but I often find that these tend to pop up a lot in key business processes for running the business, for keeping business running, for keeping operations running. So if you look to the left, we got our key business processes like payroll and benefits, our web presence, messaging and communications, payables, billing, and receivables. If we can't bring money in and we can't put money out, that's bad. That's a very bad situation. And now we can bring in our heat map. We can define it by confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We move our way through the different areas, and we can start showing, geez, here's where we need to spend our time. Because we all know when we walk into leadership meetings, we talk into any meeting of somebody who's not as interested in this work as we are, the first thing they're going to ask about are the reds. They might consider the yellows, and the greens they really don't care much about. They may in passing say, that looks pretty good, but they really don't spend much detail. And that's okay. That's an expected behavior. So what I like to kind of bring this all together is start saying, when does it hurt? I like risk profiles to be a pain chart for security, a pain chart that says, when is something painful? When does it get to the point where it's material? When you go to a hospital and you get and medical professionals ask you, what's their pain? How much? They give you these scales now. They call them pain charts. Well, we can do the same thing in our risk profile. You can say, when does it hurt? When is it a nuisance? When is it tolerable? When is it becoming harder? And when is it the point where it's now material enough that we've got to do something about it? So we need to have those pain charts to give the key for critical and key business processes that tell us, when is it material? When is the incident becoming so much that we have to take action, or it's becoming something that's truly impacting the organization? And it goes against multiple categories: financial, productivity, availability, reputation, legal, partner, supply chain, customer. This is that real critical part of the risk profile that talks about, when does it become a problem? At what point would you say that the incident's gotten to the point, or the breach is getting to the point where we have to do something? We have to take action, or we do not want to let anything get to that level. So we can build control frameworks that map right below that pain level, right below that point of materiality. And here's an example of one way that I bring these together. So we talk about material impact considerations. This just assumes an organization that has financial impact and has a $500 million revenue stream. So you might have these levels: negligible, maybe less than $100,000, all the way up to $100 million being way too much for the business, and it's catastrophic. From an availability perspective, when is it negligible? Maybe less than 2 hours. When is it catastrophic? Maybe 8 days and beyond. These will all be things that you'll decide for yourself in your own organization. These are all things that the risk profile will flush out if you do it properly, and they'll change and adjust different seasonalities, different business conditions, different levels of risk. During good times, people sometimes take less risk, and during bad times, people are taking more risk, and that's a normal expected behavior. So we have to constantly realize that, calibrate that, understand to that, and keep moving forward in that way. So I just want to finalize this conversation a little bit before we send it back and let Michael kind of come in with some of his thoughts on the topic. But the first thing I want to tell you is that information risk profiles are critical to assess of information risk management security strategy and activities. We're trying to change our approach from being an adversarial approach to an advisory approach. How do we become something that's trusted by the leader? They want to come and talk to us versus trying to force our way into their offices. We want to provide guidance and insights to the Information Risk Management Security Program and activities to make sure we're doing the right things, to make sure we're within expectation. Nobody's going to question we're spending too much or spending too little. It's going to give us an understanding saying we're doing what you asked us to do. We're building our models to what you asked us to do. And we want to make sure that we remove the negative view of risk and security professionals or activities. If we're giving guidance instead of creating requirements constantly, if we're informing, if we're working from their point of view, and they've been empowered by developing this risk profile with us, it's very hard for someone to say that we are just cost. We are just adding problems. We're putting fear, uncertainty, and doubt to try and drive activity because we do have that burden of knowledge. We have that burden of information that follows us along. So this helps us both for the risk and security professional and for the leader to calibrate, to make sure they're working together in a way that is beneficial, cohesive, and meets the business goals and objectives. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for your time, and I'll send it back to Tim.
Thanks so much, John. I always enjoy listening to you speak on this topic because you work so closely with businesses and not only with the security professionals, but with the executives in the organization. So you have a sense of how to talk to both sides. And I think that's really important when we talk about risk. As we dig into it, we start to ask the question, what are the metrics we use? How do we go about measuring risk and looking at some of the tools that are here? And so that's why it's exciting to pair John with Michael Dalgleish, who can give us some sense for, what are some of the tools that we can use? What are some of the methods we can use to kind of measure this? And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Michael, and let you talk for a little bit. I'll just remind our audience that you can ask a question anytime during the session. So please don't be shy, and we will take as many of them as we can at the end. So with that, let me hand it over to Michael.
Hey, thanks, Tim. Hey, John, great job outlining information risk appetite, do care for information, and data classification. I think you've really outlined a solid approach to vectoring risk and how the folks listening in can really move forward with understanding the risk in their organizations. We're going to spend the next few minutes kind of outlining a few controls you should ideally have in place as a best practice, and then dig into how to manage and mitigate risk in a couple of different ways. So the first thing is, the first step is to understand and apply some distinctive controls, and I'm sure everybody on the line has seen a portion of this before, but there's three major controls, and they're not technical controls, but they're based around a perfect harmony of people, process, and technology, because people use processes to use the technology, right, to manage that risk, right? The end goal is really defining and building out these risk controls, and it's really centered around an end state for your organization. And that's the ability to quickly quantify, detect, and then mitigate risk and security incidents in your organization. So one of the first control we're going to talk about is processes, and defining repeatable incident triage and investigation processes really standardize the actions your analysts and your teams can take and ensure that no important tasks really fall through the cracks, right? So if you create a repeatable incident management workflow to manage, mitigate security incidents and risks, team members' responsibilities and actions from the initial creation of an alert to the escalation to Tier 1 or Tier 2 or Tier 3 models are easily defined and adhered. Based on these workflows, resources can be effectively allocated to help mitigate it. I think one of the most frequently used incident response process models that you can model for your organization is the DOE model, which really consists of 6 stages. The preparation, identification, containment, eradication, and recovery against an incident. In addition, if you're looking for a framework that can provide some guidance, NIST SP 861 Revision 2 really provides some great guidance for developing some unique IR procedures to handle security incidents and risks. The second control that should be in place, and something you should focus on, is developing people. People are your riskiest asset in the organization, but your organization might already have some employees that are ready to step in to fill the role of an incident responder or SOC analyst. It could be IT professionals. It could be your legal team or HR team. All of them are really necessary in the event that there is a security incident. So if you look at outsourcing as an option, if you don't have those people who are on staff and can help, there are a number of organizations that do managed security services, or they can do surge incident response support. For some security teams and for some organizations, they use a mixture of both. You'll have your internal folks who can help out, but you also have some surge folks who might be on retainer to help with an IR investigation. And it's really clear that a lot of organizations rarely cover incident response needs completely with in-house staff. So there's a way, regardless of your staffing structure, to have staff with the necessary training, both on your processes and technology, to deal with some of the constantly changing and obviously quite challenging job of being a security analyst and a subject matter expert. The last control that really should be in place, obviously, is technical controls. And don't tell the vendor line. Don't build your people, your processes around technology. What you want to do is define your processes, build your people around those processes, and then pick the technology that's right for you. But when you do pick the technology, what you want to do is layer in defenses. And if you incorporate threat intelligence, asset identification, risk management, and other contextual information, it's an effective way for an enterprise to really monitor risk in the environment and any security incidents in the environment. And it really helps your SOC analysts do investigation against some of these risks. Often you have an alert that's associated with network or host-based activity, and initially it only has contextual information about an endpoint's IP address. But if you centralize a lot of these various sources of data into an operations management system, your SOC and the analysts can, get better insight into possible anomalies that might be indicative of threat activity. Security operations analysts can analyze that data from all those different sources and then interrogate and triage devices of interest and scope the incident for the risk it has towards your organization. And in order for your SOC analyst to really investigate the system in question, the analyst generally needs other information, owner information, host name information, DHCP information, data classification that John outlined in his earlier presentation. If you don't understand the data that is actually at risk, then you don't understand the full context of risk. So being able to bridge those all together with a number of technologies that aren't competing with each other really makes sense. So once you do have those three controls in place, the question is, now what, right? And I think the most important question to ask as an organization is, what can you do to stop these type of incidents from being successful? If your organization's business goals include maintaining the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and information systems, how do you achieve those goals? So there's a number of different techniques. Everybody will have a different take on this. I think John mentioned it a couple times, but it all depends on your appetite for risk and your appetite for defenses. What you really need to do is have a list of prioritized defenses that make it more difficult for that attacker to be successful. When you implement a lot of these controls together, plus technologies, they act as a layered defense, and they really give you multiple opportunities to detect and prevent the attack before it becomes a breach and before it becomes reportable under state or federal laws. When possible, the entire point of the defense is to keep those attackers from being successful. That's why, really, to ensure practical implementation of your high-level recommendations is to look at the maturity level of your information security platform and understand that your risk managers and security officers need to be able to make their own decisions on protective measures and understand those key metrics. We're going to touch on a couple of key metrics in a second. One of the interesting ways that a lot of organizations are leveraging a couple of defensive controls are through red teams and blue teams in their organization. And really, red teaming is security professionals who have the ability to determine risk to the system network before the appropriate security controls can be implemented. So to really determine risk, vulnerabilities and threats inside the environment and external to the environment have to be identified. So a red team will use tools to probe for vulnerabilities. They can project possible threats based on the scope of the assessment requested. So you have to look at the approach as more in-depth than what most potential attackers follow, because attackers are typically leveraging one hole or one vulnerability, right? Whereas your red team has to be able to find multiple holes and multiple vulnerabilities and help you understand the risk to the environment through those attacks. So red teaming really should test for all types of attacks, access, modification, denial of service, repudiation, and provide a complete security assessment. And a thorough red team assessment should provide an accurate situational awareness of the security posture of a given system or network and identify the risk through red teaming and other methods. It can't provide information security alone, but you also have to continue through some type of InfoSec process to appropriately manage the risk and provide that security protection. Now, on the topic of metrics, there's a couple different ways to measure it, and there's two key metrics that we like to talk about, and those two key metrics measure the effectiveness of your organization's security capabilities. That's mean time to detect and mean time to respond. So mean time to detect is the average amount of time it takes for an organization to identify those threats that can potentially impact the organization, and the ones that present an actual risk and which require deeper analysis and IR and response efforts. Mean time to respond is an average amount of time it takes for an organization to analyze the threat and mitigate any threats presented. A lot of organizations operate in a mode where mean time to detect and mean time to response would be measured in weeks or months. However, enterprises whose networks have been compromised are really at high risk during these incidents. So if they're seeking to reduce their cybersecurity risk, they really should look at moving these metrics into hours or days, or ideally hours and minutes. And it's hard to quantify the success of your threat management process because there's no way of knowing what damage would have been, which additional systems or accounts organizations should strive to reduce by improving the threat management capabilities. But the lower the values are during an incident, the more effective and efficient your organization could be at stopping attacks in progress and limiting their damage. Typically the recovery component isn't measured as a whole because it's really different case to case. However, there's certain parts of recovery that can be measured, such as how long it takes to notify your customers that there was a breach or after the attack is discovered. And the last thing I want to really touch on over here is kind of a fabric that we've put together, which is your end-to-end threat lifecycle management workflow. And it's really the ability to detect and respond to the threat early within the lifecycle. And it's really key to protecting your company from a large-scale impact, because the earlier an attack is detected and mitigated, the less the ultimate cost to your business, because they haven't had access to those risky assets or that IP that you've classified. So there's really 6 phases to threat lifecycle management. Phase 1 is really forensic threat collection. Before any threat really can be detected, you have to be able to see evidence of it within your environment. To do this, you need to focus on 3 principal types of data: security event and alarm data, log and machine data, and forensic sensor data. The second stage of this is, once you do have that visibility established by collecting that data, you have to have a chance of detecting and responding to threats. Discovery of those potential threats is really accomplished through a blend of search and machine analytics applied to it. On the third stage, you then have to be able to quickly quantify and assess the potential impact to your business, the urgency of additional investigation and the response efforts. The qualification process is manual and pretty time intensive, but it's also very time sensitive. So an efficient process allows you to analyze a greater number of alarms with less staff and reducing, obviously, mean time to detect and mean time to respond. On the fourth stage here, once you've actually qualified those threats, they need to be fully investigated to determine whether there's a security incident has occurred and how much risk is in the environment. You're going to need rapid access to the forensic data and intelligence on the threat, right? So automation of those routine investigatory tasks and tools, they really facilitate cross-organizational collaboration that this stage especially is ideal for optimally reducing your mean time to respond. And then you want to implement mitigations to reduce and eventually eliminate risk to the business. For some threats, such as ransomware or compromised privileged users, every second counts. Easily accessible and updated incident response processes and playbooks, coupled with automation is pretty important. And the last stage is obviously recovery. Now, once the incident has been neutralized and risk to your business is under control, you can start recovery efforts. To recover effectively, it's really important you have access to all forensic information surrounding the investigation. This includes ensuring that any changes that are made during the incident response process are tracked, and audit trail information is captured, and the affected systems are updated and brought back online. Additionally, the recovery process should ideally include putting measures in place that leverage the gathered threat intelligence to detect if the threat returns or has left a backdoor and an ingress point into the network. And this is the fabric that we maintain. It's a pretty easily achievable fabric if you put together those proper controls that we outlined at the beginning. Tim, back over to you.
Wow. Dark Reading does a lot of these webinars, and we always have two speakers, and I'll confess that sometimes the two presentations don't always connect really well. In this case, we had it was almost like it was one presentation. You guys did a great job really pulling together, John going through the whole, sort of risk profile, how to set up this whole discussion, and then Mike talking us through, the whole process of really understanding how to manage an incident, what costs are, what the risks are, and how to measure it. Great job by both of you. I'm gonna take some questions here in a minute. Please get those ready. If you have questions, please submit them. Before we begin that, please direct your attention to our webinar survey available on the right of the presentation window. If you close the survey, you can reopen the widget by clicking the icon along the bottom of your screen. Thanks in advance for filling out the feedback form. Your participation in the survey allows us to better serve you. And now, as we go into the Q&A, just to remind everyone, if you have a question, please type it into the text box located to the right of the presentation window, or click the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. If we're not able to answer all submitted questions during today's webinar, we'll be sure to share them with our speakers who can reply to you over email. I'm going to start with a question that came directly to you, John, during your presentation, and I'll just read it. It says, John, it sounds like you put a high priority on a comprehensive model that represents both business data and processes. In other words, you have to know what you have before you can assess the risks. Have you found such models common or lacking?
Oh, it's a great question, and I thank the person who asked it. So it really is that simple. You can't protect what you don't know, right? And you can't value until you understand what you have. Unfortunately, what I find is a lot of organizations are not the best at understanding where all their information is. Key business processes are a little easier. It's a little easier to go to the financial groups and go to the business process owners and the product management teams and say, what are the things that make us special? What are the important things that are critical to operations? What is it that we go to market as, and what are the things that are important to support our going to market? When you start getting into the information elements that support those processes, that's where we often find that we're lacking that, what I call asset inventory. We're real good at the inventory of technology. We're getting better at that and getting easier. But I really want to understand where all the data is and all the different places data flows. And as we build out these profiles and as we build out these conversations, and I really like some of the things that Michael was saying, how are we going to measure some of these things and figure some things out, we have no choice but to really figure that out, because you're going to end up having problems where you least expect them. A lot of times the adversaries are not coming after your most obvious areas, especially if they're knowledgeable and they've taken time to learn about you and understand you. They want to be with you as long as they possibly can. They want to siphon things away from you as slowly and quietly as possible. And without an understanding of where all that data resides, you're in trouble. In many cases, I've been involved in incident response efforts where the customer didn't even know they had that kind of data until they were going through a breach. And we were in a breach response situation where an outside party told them about these things. And immediately they said to themselves, how could we not know where that is? How we could become to the point where we become so disparate and so separated in our operations that we've lost track of that. And really now we're going back and saying, geez, we got to know where that is before we can have a good, solid conversation.
I wonder, Michael, do you want to talk about that? I know Logarithm's been doing this for many years now, the sort of the understanding of kind of what you have and sort of taking advantage of the various logs and data that you have on systems and security systems around the network. Do you want to talk at all about how companies go about doing that?
There's a couple different paths there, and I think John outlined it pretty well on his earlier conversation. The first thing you have to do is understand the data, and separate from log data or security data, you have to understand the data that's important to you, whether it's IP data, whether it's financial information, medical health records. If you don't know where it is and you can't find it, it's pretty hard to quantify risk, and it's pretty hard to defend against and protect, right? So if you look at quantifying, and let's say you do have a plan in place, you have quantified that data, you have categorized it, you do have it in different buckets, whether it's confidential or public domain or whatever, then you have to understand where it is. Once you understand where it is, you can leverage a tool like we were talking about, a security operations monitoring tool, where you are pulling in a lot of that event data, because what you're going to do is set different risk or priority levels within your tool to monitor those systems that have direct access, or those users that have direct access to that classified data or that data that's been categorized. So it's a combination of first classifying and outlining your data, and then knowing where it is so that your SIM of choice, Logarithm hopefully, will be able to detect when there is an access to that data or any type of anomaly coming from that data.
Okay, thank you. A question that I had about the changes that occur sort of on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis. As you're measuring risk and looking at sort of your current situation, and your CEO is asking, are we safe right now? Are there ways that you can kind of create metrics that vary, from month to month or day to day, with the threat or with the data that you're collecting? I mean, do you get to that point where, today we're at DEFCON 1 and, yesterday we were at DEFCON 5? Is it smart to measure risk on that, kind of dynamic level? And if you can do it, how should you go about doing that? Either one of you.
Wow,
John, you
that's
go
a heck
first.
of a question.
On.
Yeah, it's a heck of a question. I think that from my perspective, I like to build out the threat and vulnerability analysis concept that talks about scenario-based modeling and scenario-based impacts. So we can plan to a lot of the scenarios that exist, or we can at least identify scenarios that are likely to occur or even unlikely to occur, at least have them in our back pockets of, if these things happen, they will look like this and feel like this. And really, I look at, depending on tools like the tools from Logarithm and others, a lot of Logarithm actually, to help me dial that in. So if I can understand indicators, if I can understand conversations of, here's how I'm seeing movement in the adversary community, movement in attack patterns, attack trends, I can start building threat and vulnerability analysis scenarios to assess what that would look like, to help me find leading indicators, find behavioral modeling, find data behavior, user behavior, process behavior adjustments, which then I can go leverage a SIEM and intelligence tools like Logarithm's tools and others that will help me to look as early warning radar and follow the progression, not just initial detection, but as Michael really said, that meantime concept of response, how well we're doing, how well prepared we were, not just is it happening. Michael, please tell me your thoughts.
Yeah, good segue. I think once you have done that, you've done all the modeling. The next portion of that is having proper incident response management metrics tied to those, right? Meantime to detect and meantime to respond are important. So does mean time to letting the CEO or board know that something's going on before it becomes a public disclosure issue. And you can do that a couple of different ways. As you've modeled security incidents, and believe me, there's incidents happening all the time. They might be small, like an employee hits a website and they get exploited, and your IT team takes care of it within 30 minutes because they were flying American Airlines and they were on the Wi-Fi and they were trying to watch the game or something. Once that incident has happened, you have a baseline of how quick it took for your IT team to get that detection and then obviously remediate it, either re-imaging the machine or locking down the employee's account. Once you do have those key metrics, you really have to have an incident response platform in place that can measure those metrics over time. So if traditionally it takes about 30 minutes to remediate, a soft target like an employee's laptop, then you should be holding your security analyst teams, your SOC analysts, to account for those timelines at 30 minutes to respond to this type of incident. So it's kind of like behavior modeling. You have to have a data lake of information, and in this case, you'd have to have a data lake of security incidents to understand what an acceptable time is, and then apply that timing to whatever your risk appetite is.
Thanks, guys. We're reached the top of the hour here, and I'm afraid we're out of time for questions. If you have any more questions for the speakers, please feel free to submit them. We do have the ability to get back to you over email, following the event here. I want to thank John and Michael for their time and expertise on today's topic. Thanks also to our sponsor, Logarithm, as well as everyone in the audience. We appreciate your attention and participation. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been available to listen to the event. This webinar is copyright 2017 by UBM. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and Logarithm, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guests, John Parenti and Michael Daglish, I'm Tim Wilson. Thanks for your time and have a great day.
Thanks, Tim.